Okay, I wanted to make a video, and I guess this will be an installment in the Who Said It Better series, which I've promised for a while, but have really only been providing foundational or supporting information for. Um, so, in the question, Who Said It Better? What we're asking is, of the various Jesus sayings, who is more likely to have said them? Either a peaceful, itinerant Jewish rabbi who was somehow disenfranchised from the mainstream, we're to believe, who said an awful lot of anti Jewish, pro Gentile stuff, or a Roman general who was engaged in a campaign of exterminating Jews, who later became emperor, and whose father was also a higher ranking Roman general who became emperor before him, so that the son succeeded the father as the Roman state god, the emperor. So, does that ring any bells for you? Uh, a father and a son who are both God. So, so I was thinking about the Garden of Gethsemane, and it says it's supposed to be pronounced Gethsemane, Gethsemane, I guess in Greek, but in King James English, or, in just Americanized English, I guess, we tend to pronounce it Gethsemane. So this word in Greek, and it says it's of Aramaic origin. I think in the Messianic Bible they pronounce it Gotchamanaim or something. So there's got, which is a word for wine press in the sense of treading out grapes, it says, and then maybe this is, shemen, probably oil, like olive oil, used for anointing, shemen, oil, yeah. So, in Hebrew, got shemen, although there may be more syllables to it. You'd have to actually see the word, and I guess it would be in modern conversational Hebrew, because I don't imagine that the word exists anywhere in the Hebrew Tanakh. So, anyway, I could close that. But in Greek, in the outline of biblical usage, it says that this means an oil press, because it's like a grape press, but in this case for oil. Now, in here we see that there's only two occurrences of this name: Matthew 26:36, Mark 14:32, and now I also did a search for garden, and there's a mention of garden in John 18. Luke doesn't seem to mention a garden or Gethsemane, which is kind of interesting. I guess I could search for ear and see if he's got the same story about the ear, which we'll get into. Is that in Luke? Come on. What are you... That's Matthew. So this should be Luke. smote the servant of the high priest. Okay, so there is the narrative in Luke 22, so I'll click on that. And let's see. Now in this added heading it mentions Garden of Gethsemane, but here it cites the location as the Mount of Olives. So if it was the Mount of Olives rather than, well, that's different. Mount of Olives, wouldn't that be like Har, and then whatever the word for olive is, whereas Got Shemen means a press for oil. So it seems like there's kind of a parallel there in these two names, like a thematic parallel in the specific wording of these two names. But, okay, so there is in Luke 22 the narrative. So we could go over them. Let's see, I should start with Mark should really come first, since some of the other Gospels are supposedly based on the text of Mark. So I would kind of like to work with a harmonized version, but okay, so it's talking about Jesus in Gethsemane, and they went to a place which was called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here." That's in the Revised Standard Version. The King James Version, it says, "Sit ye down here," I think, which I did a search for that, and that's used in Ruth chapter 4, verse 2. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit ye down here," and they sat down, and it's about like, buying a piece of land. So I don't know if there's any connection there, but I just wanted to point out that those words are strangely used in very few places in the Hebrew Tanakh. So we should start with Mark. "And they went to a place which was called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.'" That is, iesous. "And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled." Now, there were 3 resistance fighters in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem, executed by Titus. That is, the siege was executed by Titus, or carried out by Titus. I'm not saying necessarily that those 3 resistance fighters were all executed, because that's not the case. Anyway, one of them was Simon Bar Giora, who I believe we can equate with Peter, or Simon Peter, elsewhere in the Gospels. The other is John, I think it's John of Gischala, something like that. And then there's a third one, I think that's Menachem. So one wonders, I'm wondering now if James actually represents Menachem. So he took with him these 3 and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. So I think that word troubled there is similar to like tribulation. Ademonea, ademonea, moneo, and to be troubled, great distress or anguish, depressed. And we might need to take a look at that word again later. Now, I believe Joseph Atwill covers this, and he equates, and I'll get to that anyway, I'll get to that. and he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell. Okay, so that watch is important, because that has to do with eyes and with seeing. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, so his hour of watching, he prayed that that might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to thee. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt." So even though this is the Revised Standard Version, I guess it preserves the honorific. I've heard it called honorific when it's really just archaic English. So anyway, whatever. And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep?" So there's a direct equation of the name Peter with the name Simon. "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour?" Again, watching. "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And immediately while he was speaking, Judas came. So Judas is taken as his betrayer. Now we know it's not a great stretch, people. Literarily, Judas is a representation of the Jewish people, right? He's the one who betrayed the Messiah. We are to believe. And Judas comes from Yehuda, which is the southern kingdom of Yehuda, and those are the only tribes of Israel, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, that returned from the Babylonian captivity. The northern kingdoms of Israel didn't return from deportation, I think, by the Assyrians. So basically, in the first century, the Jewish people were predominantly Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, those tribes. So, but Jerusalem, Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom of Judah, right? If you drew the lines for the old southern kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem is found within its borders. So Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now, if you know about the siege of Jerusalem, then at a certain point, Titus and his forces, his legions, were outside the walls of Jerusalem. And meanwhile, on the inside the walls of Jerusalem, especially in the Temple Mount complex of Herod's temple, if you want to call it that, or the second temple, but this temple plateau that Herod created, where he expanded the plateau of the temple by erecting these retaining walls. One of those retaining walls being the Western Wall, some call it the Wailing Wall, but the wall where Jews go to get as close as they can to the most holy place without defiling it. Because, they have to be ritually cleansed. They don't want to walk on the most holy place without being ritually cleansed. So, Now the betrayer had given them but at this particular time, in the 1st century, the temple was standing. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." So Judah, the Jewish people, are attempting to seize iesous and lead him away under guard. And when he, Judas, came, he went up to him at once and said, "Master," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword. So one of the disciples of iesous, one of the disciplined ones, one of the trained ones of iesous, drew his sword and struck, and is probably, if I remember correctly, one of those swords where iesous said, now's the time to sell what you have and buy some swords. And then, I've seen it portrayed that one of the disciples took one of the knives used in the preparation of the Passover or the Last Supper, and then said, "Look, I don't know, Master or Rabbi or Lord, here is a sword." And then I think iesous says, "It is enough," almost like the Passover liturgy, saying, where they say, "Dayenu," it would have been enough. And anyway, so one of the disciplined ones struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now, just like I said, watching and eyes are something to stay focused on in this. Also, ears are important. And iesous said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber?" Now, robber, this is the word that's used of the Jewish zealots, supposedly, allegedly, they're accused of being robbers, just mere robbers, not resistance fighters, not legitimate combatants, but they denigrate them or cast aspersions on them by calling them robbers. And have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the scriptures be filled. Now, if this iesous is a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, which I believe it is, it just makes the most sense. And in some of the most enigmatic, mysterious Jesus sayings, if you plug Titus in place of iesous, what he says makes perfect sense all of a sudden. So I think there were times before the war started, or even before a siege started, that the Roman legions would send their spies in to a city to scope it out. And you can see that in one place where iesous tells his disciples to, I think, go up to Jerusalem and prepare the Passover. And then, anyway, so, and they all forsook him and fled. So, all of a sudden his disciples, abandoned him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. Now, Joseph Atwill, I believe he has something to say about this linen cloth, this young man with the linen cloth. For one, he points out how, everybody just passes over this. They don't really know who or what this is, and nobody goes, huh? They just, because no one really knows what this is about, they just glide right over this passage. So he had a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, Joseph Atwill, I believe, points out the significance of this linen cloth. Now, and then we can stop there. Now, the other passages I think are basically parallel. Let's see. So here it's Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which, if if maybe that was a different James, but if that was James, the brother of Jesus, then he shouldn't have been a son of Zebedee. He should have been a son of Joseph, unless James is taken to be Iesus's half-brother, as if like Mary, the mother of Jesus, married someone else after Joseph. I don't know. Whatever. It's so. I'm just going to look for the parts that are different. Now, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. So the cup, I believe that the cup is representative of Jerusalem within its walls, with the cup being, the outer shape of the cup, but everybody inside the city's walls being the contents of the cup. And when that cup gets pressed, then the blood runs, when the residents of the cup get pressed, then the blood runs and you've got liquid in the cup. So, let's see. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, thy will be done. Now, Vespasian left the siege of Jerusalem in the hands of Titus. Vespasian was allegedly pressed into service to become the new emperor, so he left for Rome and left this military campaign in the hands of Titus. So this is a little different. Here Jesus says to Judas, "Friend, why are you here?" Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." I think that's paralleled in the book of Revelation, that ethic. And then it concludes, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" Matthew 26, 53. Oh, and that was the reason okay, here we go. So, here's the Greek on that last saying, and here he says, "Don't you think the Father will put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" And that word in Greek is legion. So it's literally a legion, just like a Roman legion. Now, which word was this? Oh, that was me looking up the word for troubled. So I asked Google AI, how many legions were in Vespasian's military? Vespasian's military consisted of a total of 22 legions under his command. He reorganized the legions in the east, replacing a single army of 4 legions with 3 armies in Cappadocia, or Cappadocia maybe, Syria and Judea, bringing the total to 6 legions in that region alone, Additionally, there were other legions stationed in other parts of the empire. So, in fulfillment of this saying, where one of the disciplined ones impulsively lashes out to strike the slave or servant of the high priest and cut off his ear, he responds, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my father, who I take to be Vespasian, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" Angels is just a Greek word meaning messenger, right? It doesn't have to be a winged heavenly being. It can very easily be a human messenger. So this was much better said by Titus than by iesous, a peaceful, itinerant, traveling rabbi, who didn't have any earthly soldiers at his command, and who had not really shown any evidence that he had legions of heavenly angels to come to his defense. But here, if you plug in Titus, that perfectly describes Titus according to history. So we'll just close that. And we've already checked out Mark. Now, the thing with the eyes and the ears, I believe because the Roman military had the exploratores and the speculatores. And the exploratores were the scouts in the Roman military. Now, the role of a military scout is you go out and you're looking for enemy forces, and you can spot them from a distance, and you can assess the size of their forces, what sort of forces they are, their direction of travel, when you might encounter them. And that's the role of a scout. Scouts aren't really meant to bring sufficient force against the enemy. Their role is not to get into a battle with the enemy. The Roman military also had the speculatores, which were like overseers, or you could say bishops, or supervisors, in that but probably more properly spies. Really, overseers probably better describe scouts, but that term speculatores seems to suggest something about seeing to me. But really, a spy gets into a population, and he's close enough that he can use his ears to hear what's going on. So that when iesous talks about, at first, when I learned about the Caesar's Messiah thesis, the statements that iesous made about he who has eyes to see, let him see, and he who has ears to hear, let him hear, those seem to me to be pleadings by the writers, the inventors of the Christian myth, that readers or hearers would wake up and see what they're trying to tell the readers or the hearers, but that people just bought in so much to the surface story of the Gospels that they're, despite having eyes and despite having ears, they would neither see nor hear what the text is really saying. So that for 2,000 years, everyone just took the surface meaning of the Gospels at face value, and it wasn't really until Joseph Atwill that the code got cracked and we could see that this literature, if not written by, or concocted by, or cooked up by, it was at least sponsored by the Roman Flavians. And that whereas the elites in Roman society probably knew what was going on in these texts, and they could laugh at the Roman dark humor that's being employed in the Gospels. Obviously, the uneducated, I think the term that either Robert Eisenman or Joseph Atwill likes to use is the hoi polloi, which is basically just the common people, the uneducated rabble. They really didn't have the education or the literacy to be able to see that this new mystery religion was about the Roman Flavians. And really we've all for the last 2,000 years been hoodwinked by these Gospels and the surface narrative. Either you believed in it because probably you were a Gentile and iesous says many things that really touch your heart. There's no way that I can deny that because I experienced it myself. But you know what? Disney movies can touch my heart. Lots of things can touch your heart. That doesn't make it true. So, or you may have been Jewish, and then you didn't accept Christianity because you already had a perfectly good religion, but also because your perfectly good religion actually commanded you against receiving Christianity. There were actual commandments that basically inoculated you against receiving Christianity. But then the Romans create Christianity in order to inoculate non-Jews against Torah, against Judaism. So let me just make sure, okay. So now I can close this. Now, this whole narrative about why the disciples would not, while he watched as a scout, a military scout, why would they not stay awake and watch with him? Now, you can watch this video. I'm not going to play it because it's copyrighted, but this is a scene that represents very well the reality of pulling a guard shift in the Army when you're deployed into a threatening environment. Basically, what the scene shows is that one soldier, this guy, is passing on his equipment to the next soldier for the next guard shift, and that soldier is played by Charlie Sheen. Then Charlie Sheen finishes his guard shift, and then he tries to pass that equipment off to the next soldier. Well, that soldier goes back to sleep with the equipment, leaving all of these guys in the bush, in the rain, in Vietnam, unguarded. So, now, I cannot probably sufficiently describe to you I don't know. It might be similar. I've never had a child myself. It might be similar to having to stay up through the night with a child, um, something like that. Or, if you had a loved one who's in the hospital and they're not doing well, you might have had to sit next to them in the hospital through the night. I won't rule out the possibility that it's very similar to that. But in the Army, uh, when deployed to 24/7 war games that would last like 2 weeks long, um, I would get so exhausted. And in fact, Charlie Sheen at the beginning of this movie, Platoon, I think he talks about how tired he gets. But I would get so exhausted, even at age 20, I think it was 20 then, that I could sleep anywhere in any position through anything. Kind of like you see a toddler do, where it's like their switch is just turned off, like their father or their mother can pick them up from one sleeping position and they're just dead weight. They don't even wake up. And then they can carry them to bed without the child even waking up. I slept on top of a poncho on the ground in the open air in Arkansas in September, with occasional drizzle and rain, and I was just so tired I could sleep like that. So I learned that, as provided the temperature was bearable, I could sleep anywhere. Another time I climbed into the back of a truck, and it had an enclosed back. It was called a Cuck V, but a special kind of Cuck V that we used in Alaska, but we were in Arkansas for the war games. I climbed into the back of that enclosed part of this Cuck V, which was essentially a Chevy Blazer that was militarized, and it was filled with hefty bags of garbage. I climbed onto the top of the pile of those garbage bags. Strangely, I couldn't smell anything, but I just slept right on top of that pile of garbage bags, and I slept pretty darn well. And it was only until after dawn, and I think that mortar simulators were going off, that I finally woke up. So you can get to that point of exhaustion where it can be difficult to pull your guard shift. And the thing is, if another guy's on guard shift, you're not going to stay up with them just to hang out with them. You're trying to get your sleep. So this narrative much more represents the situation that Roman military men would be experiencing deployed against Jewish forces who are defending their city. Like, that's just that's just how it is, man. Soldiers are not going to stay up just to hang out with you during your guard shift. So when iesous is like, to his disciplined ones, his disciples, his trained ones, why wouldn't you stay up with me and watch with me as a scout? It's just, any soldier knows the answers because you're too damn tired and you want your sleep. So anyway, you can watch this scene either here, or you can watch Platoon the movie and see the scene in the movie, but it kind of plays out similar to the narrative in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, so I believe this is the passage where Joseph Atwill equates the Garden of Gethsemane narrative with what transpires with Titus during the siege of Jerusalem. There is also John chapter 18. Let's see. And I think here in John it says that this was happening by the Kidron, the brook or stream or river Kidron, where was a garden into which he entered and his disciples, and Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place. So the Jews knew the place, for iesous ofttimes resorted hither with his disciples. Judas then, a lot of this are probably accretions, where you've got like Christian scribes or monks or whatever who they're trying to explain things that they don't really understand, so they try to fill it up with explanations to make it make more sense. But if they really at that point knew that iesous represented Titus Flavius, they probably wouldn't have gone to such lengths to explain some of the parts that they didn't understand, because they might have then better understood what these passages meant. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, and this time it's the Pharisees, when supposedly the Pharisees weren't part of the temple establishment, some scholars say, but I think there were Pharisees definitely in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem, and they came hither with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? Or who do you seek? Let me switch to the Revised Standard Version here. And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. iesous said to them, I am he, blah, blah, blah. This is like John's rather simplistic kind of dialogue. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. I think that's an important point. Again, he asked them, Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word which he had spoken. Of those whom thou gavest me, I lost not one. And so this is kind of portrays iesous or Titus being alone at one point, as in the others where they say the disciples basically abandoned him. Then Simon Peter, here we have it as one name, having a sword, and here it actually identifies who did the cutting, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. That slave's name was Malchus. That was probably some marginal notation that got incorporated into the text. And iesous said to Peter, Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which the Father has given me? So here it doesn't say anything about legions of angels. And then it goes into, looks like a kangaroo court or something. So then we've got Luke. And I think Luke doesn't mention, yeah, here it says Mount of Olives. And he came out and went as he was as he was wont. Let me change this to Revised Standard Version. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came into the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Other ancient authorities add verse 43, "And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him." Other ancient authorities add 44, "And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and this sweat became like great drops of blood falling down upon the ground." Interesting, because like Mormonism places, or has at least in the past, I don't know if they still do, placed more emphasis on the Garden of Gethsemane than on the crucifixion at was it Golgotha, I think. So, and they believe that actually more of the salvation act actually occurred in Gethsemane because of this great drops of blood falling down upon the ground, which they take to be literal. Whereas it clearly says this sweat became like great drops of blood. It's a metaphor. It's trying to say he was suffering. But they take it literally. "And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, 'Why do you sleep? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation.' While he was speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew nearer to iesous to kiss him. But iesous said to him, 'Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?' And when those who were about him saw what would follow, they said, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear." So I think this cutting off the right ear is like one. I believe it's saying that a spy got struck at this point. But iesous said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and healed him. Again, such a simplistic version of what was said, his reaction. Then iesous said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, older men had come out against him. Really? This is just trying to demonize the elders of Israel, the older men of Israel, because the older men of Israel have the authority to expound on the Torah. "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." So, let me close that. We can close Gethsemane. Now, the passage in Josephus. So, let me see if I can blow this up some. Anyway, this march of the Romans seemed to the Jews to be a flight. As for the watchman who was placed upon the wall, gave a signal. By shaking his garment, there came out a fresh multitude of Jews, and that with such mighty violence that one might compare it to the running of the most terrible wild beasts. So, instead of non-Jews, who are sometimes symbolized by the term wild beasts, here this text is saying that the Jews were wild beasts. So these came out from the walls of Jerusalem to attack the Romans. This march of the Romans seemed to the Jews to be a flight. so that they thought that the Romans were fleeing, in other words. To say the truth, none of those that opposed them could sustain the fury with which they made their attacks, but as if they had been cast out of an engine, they brake the enemy's ranks to pieces, who were put to flight and ran away to the mountain. So, I think it's saying that the Romans counterattacked, and then the Jews ran away to the mountain. None but Titus himself and a few others with him, being left in the midst of the acclivity. I think that's like a high point or precipice. Now these others, who were his friends, despised the danger they were in, and were ashamed to leave their general, earnestly exhorting him to give way to these Jews that are fond of dying, and not to run into such dangers before those that ought to stay before him, to consider what his fortune was. I think this is the Whitstone translation of Flavius Josephus's The Wars of the Jews. It can be kind of hard to read it, because it's like there are these long run-on sentences. Those that ought to stay before him, to consider what his fortune was, and not by supplying the place of a common soldier, to venture to turn back upon the enemy so suddenly, and this because he was general in the war, and lord of the habitable earth. I mean, there you have it right there. The text is saying that Titus was considered lord, on whose preservation the public affairs do all depend. These persuasions Titus seemed not so much as to hear, but opposed those that ran upon him, and smote them on the face. And when he had, so there's the striking of the ear, and when he had forced them to go back, he slew them. I think one of the versions of the cutting of the ear in the King James Version may use the term smote or smite. I would have to go back and check. Of course, that doesn't matter so much in the English as it does in the Greek, so you would have to compare the Greek of Flavius Josephus to the Greek of the Gospels. He also fell upon great numbers as they marched down the hill, and thrust them forward, while those men were so amazed at his courage and his strength that they could not fly directly to the city, but declined from him on both sides, and pressed after those that fled up the hill. Yet did he still fall back upon their flank, and put a stop to their fury. In the meantime, now I think it's assumed that Titus was actually mounted on a horse at this time, but anyway, in the meantime a disorder and a terror fell again among those that were fortifying their camp, I think those were Romans, at the top of the hill, upon their seeing those beneath them running away, insomuch that the whole legion was dispersed, while they thought that the sallies of the Jews upon them were plainly unsupportable, and that Titus was himself put to flight, because they took it for granted that if he had stayed, the rest would never have fled for it. So this is where they abandoned Titus, and they think that Titus must have fled with them, because they didn't believe that the forces would have fled if Titus had remained there. Thus were they encompassed on every side by a kind of panic fear, and some dispersed themselves one way, and some another, till certain of them saw their general in the very midst of an action, and being under great concern for him, they loudly proclaimed the danger he was in to the entire legion. And now shame made them turn back, and they reproached one another that they did worse than run away by deserting Caesar. So there, where the disciples deserted iesous in the Gethsemane narrative, here we have a clear example of Titus's disciplined ones, disciples, trained ones, deserting him at a point. So they used their utmost force against the Jews, and declining from the straight declivity, they drove, I think that means like descending the hill, the downward slope, they drove them on heaps into the bottom of the valley. And that might be the Kidron Valley, I'm not sure. Then did the Jews turn about and fight them, but as they were themselves retiring. And now because the Romans had the advantage of the ground and were above the Jews, they drove them all into the valley. Titus also pressed upon those that were near him, and there's that word press, and I think it occurs somewhere else here also, pressed. Right here. Pressed after those that fled up the hill. Pressed upon those who were near him. So twice it uses this word pressed, and I'm not sure if Joseph Atwill did this, but I'm kind of connecting this to the oil press of Gethsemane. Titus also pressed upon those that were near him and sent the legion again to fortify their camp, while he and those that were with him before opposed the enemy and kept them from doing farther mischief, insomuch that, if I may be allowed neither to add anything out of flattery nor to diminish anything out of envy, neither add nor diminish, that's Torah talk right there. But to speak the plain truth, Caesar did twice deliver that entire legion. So Titus twice delivered or rescued that entire legion, or saved, that word deliver, sometimes translated save, did deliver that entire legion when it was in jeopardy, and gave them a quiet opportunity of fortifying their camp. So this is why I say that the Gethsemane narrative better represents, was better said by Titus Flavius than by a peaceful itinerant Jewish rabbi by the name of Joshua, without the hard J sound, right? Yehoshua, whatever, because of the scouting and spying themes, because of the guard shift themes, typical of the military, just common military practice, and because of both iesous and both Titus being deserted by their disciplined ones. But I think one of the most forceful sayings was when he says, "Do you not think that I can ask my father for a dozen legions, of messengers to come support me, to defend me?" That's way more representative of Titus, who was left to finish off this war against the Jews by his father Vespasian, than it is of, this unproven as yet, even according to the Christian Gospels, messianic claimant who had not as yet shown any evidence that he was able to be defended by even one legion, quote unquote, of heavenly angels, much less 12 of them. So that's why I say Titus said it better